Hello everybody and welcome to another live stream. So today's live stream will actually be quite different. I'm actually going to be live streaming a piece that was essentially commissioned. So I'm actually just going to turn off the title card here. So on the top right here, you can actually see the item that I actually built, and I built this in Blender. It's before the new release of 2.8, just so you're aware. So this is using the old formatted Blender to create this cufflink design essentially. And today I will be actually printing it on my Anycubic. So that's actually the main screen that you're seeing here. And I'm going to be starting this print shortly. So I've gone ahead and I've actually done a previous test print, because I had to calibrate with a change of nozzle. And I was also running into a couple of issues with my SD card. So at the end of this 3D print, I'll go ahead and show you what it looks like with the one that I've already cleaned up. There's very little supports that are actually needed with this because of the type of design that was done. I did make sure to minimize it as much as possible. And considering I'm actually printing at a 0.1 layer height, the amount of detail that I actually got on this was actually really good. So I'm actually kind of excited to see this. Now, in this case, the individual that I designed this for is actually going to have this, I believe, printed in silver by an external company because they'll be casting it. I'm assuming that they're using the loss method for this. So the measurements will actually probably be shrunk down to a much smaller size, which is fine as long as you're using a smaller nozzle height. Also, you can also tilt the actual print to essentially get a better resolution if you need to. But because of how I designed this, essentially the only type of supports that are actually needed in this case are right in this little tiny corner here. It's actually just underneath here, and that just gives it a bit of a sharper corner. What I did do compared to the original design is actually extended the base of the item, and that's specifically to help prevent the need of any support material. This makes the overall piece a lot stronger in the long run, and it causes a lot less problems with the printing process. Now, this thing, in this case, this is actually the uncombined version. So in this case, after I took a pretty good look at it and I sent photos, I combined these objects afterwards. Right now, though, just going to zoom here and here. So you guys can actually see this a little bit better. This is actually still at low res. Now, what I did discover is that in Blender, you can actually add essentially a modifier that temporarily smooths it, but you can always reverse it. So if I do this, this is actually the mesh. However, with the modifier, it makes it look like it's actually been smoothed, but it's not a permanent smooth. And I did the same thing here. So there's actually a smooth on this, because without it, it looks too blocky. And in this case, I wanted it super smooth, just to match with the top portion. Now, what I do still need to do with this is I actually need to cut out essentially a little hole in the base to the right dimensions. I'll probably actually make it a little bit larger, and it will print pretty good. The main difference is essentially as they scale it, because this will have to be scaled for sure. That will essentially just grow and expand as well. The good news is it won't matter too much because it's actually covering another portion, so if it's not 100%, it actually won't make a huge difference. In case you're wondering what type of printer I'm using the Anycubic i3 Mega. I've actually currently, let me just get this little part out. I've actually currently added also a upgrade to the extruder, and that's actually made a pretty big difference. But because I added upgrade, I also had to increase the flow rate a lot. So I went from 100% flow rate to about 400. And that's because I didn't want to play with the firmware in this case. I have had to play with firmware in the past. I don't exactly enjoy doing it. But if you're more comfortable doing that in the firmware, you can totally just change the steps in the firmware, and that would actually fix the issue. I just honestly found it easier just to play with the flow rate, because then I'm not playing with any of the core components in the software. And it's also temporary, so if I want to, I can actually technically reduce the flow quite a bit and get less material going through. So depending on the material I'm using, it actually gives me a bit more flexibility. So this print, I believe, will take about 45 minutes. It's going to be a pretty long print. Not too long, but considering how much detail is going into this, the time frame is actually not too bad. The final size of it is also, for this test print at least, is actually quite larger in comparison to what the final dimensions need to be. Because this one is actually printed at 30 centimeters, or sorry, 3 centimeters. It's been a while since I used centimeters. I'm used to using imperial now. So closer to 1 1/4 for the bottom diameter of this file. So I may actually run into a couple issues with this because I actually pulled off the base portion to keep it from any filament from getting stuck to it, but it seems to be pretty good, so I might be okay. We'll actually find out in the next layer or two. It doesn't matter because I have one that did work out, so I do have something to show you guys at the end anyway. And like I said, I did very minimal cleaning. Essentially the only thing I did was remove very minor amount of stringing to it and remove the supports, and there's very little supports. The only supports are on the tips of the pedals. Other than that, it actually printed perfectly. If it wasn't for the fact that it would take more than 45 minutes, I probably would have actually printed at 0.08. I do find it gives me the best resolution. Also, at that printing height, I get a lot less delamination between the layers because it gets heated up. So I do find that tends to be the butter zone for this printer, at least with my current settings. I have actually changed filament as well. So the filament that I am using is actually a Canadian brand. It's Econofil. It's actually a really awesome filament. So far, it's the only filament that actually prints perfectly on this bed and does not peel off. And I've tried quite a few different filaments. So for the price too, in Canadian it was about $16, and if you get over $150 worth, you get free shipping. The only downside is when they sell out, it takes forever for them to get it back in. Needless to say, I ordered a huge amount because it's going to be 1 or 2 months before they get more in. But I am pretty satisfied with it so far. So this is currently the base that's printing for it. So this base has actually a couple layers. So what you're seeing right now is the base layer before the infill actually starts to print. I think there's only a couple layers of the infill. Let me just check. I have Cura open in a different computer. So let's see. Yeah, it has a couple layers. I have about 10 or 15 layers for the base and the top. It adds a bit on the printing time, but it's totally worth it because you run into a lot less issues. Okay, so I'm actually going to stop talking just because I think you guys might enjoy more of the music track that I actually have on here, or just watching the print. Uh, so I'll let you guys be. Yes, so far I mostly have some test prints. I actually only completed this a couple days ago. I've been really working hard on my Kickstarter, so which is hopefully launching at midnight tomorrow. Um, so I haven't had too much time for it. But generally for stuff like this, just because I've done actually quite a bit of prototyping over the past year and a half, I don't normally need to do all that many test prints. Um, like I actually did one test print and it was actually fine. So this one's actually probably pretty much ready to go. I may do one additional one where I try shrinking it to the exact size. But for that print, I'm gonna have to actually tilt it as well. Um, and that's so that I get a bit more resolution by doing so. So with 3D printing, especially with FDM printing, um, most of your highest resolution is actually on the side because you can control the height of the printing. Now that will depend to a certain degree on the nozzle. I'm using a 0.4 nozzle, so you can actually do quite a bit. Um, you could technically go to 0.6. My previous printer didn't handle that very well. This one should actually be pretty good. The main issue I did run into, though, is if you're using really cheap filaments, they delaminate. Um, so I honestly found that at 0.8, 0.08 millimeters in height, you essentially get the maximum amount of resolution. So please let me know if you actually heard that response, because I actually don't know if you have. Because then I'll type it out as much as I can, but it'll be a much shorter explanation if that's the case. In this case, well, it depends on what I'm doing. So, um, for instance, my keychain designs, which I don't know if you guys have actually seen, the final keychains. So I've actually done quite a few different things in the past year and a half. So, fortunately, I'm going to cover up this print a little bit. So this is a prototype for a pendant. So for those ones, I do actually finish the final print. So I have to actually do quite a bit of sanding, polishing to get a better result before I can actually make casted versions. And the same goes with this guy here, which is the keychain. So these are the keychains that are going to be in my Kickstarter as well. The pendants will not, at least for the time being. They may not actually be released, so we'll see. But yeah, a lot of the... Before you can make molds and do a lot more casting, there is a lot of sanding. And some corners are really tight, so it gets a bit difficult sometimes to get into those tight corners. It is worth it though. But I will say though, the type of printer that you have really does matter. If you have a very reliable printer, a lot of that can be mitigated to a very reasonable amount. This printer in particular seems really good. The first printer that I had was terrible, but this one is amazing. In comparison at least. So I had to work about 10 times harder just to get close to the same result. This one, I don't have to try as much. But the good news is, because I had a more difficult printer to work with initially, it also means I can troubleshoot and figure out what the problems are a lot easier, because I've pretty much gone through, I think, almost all the problems. Very true. Um, you'd be surprised how much I've used it though. There's a lot of stuff that I've used it for so far. Um, Generally, if you like tinkering with stuff, this is probably actually a pretty good idea to get one. Um, because it allows me to essentially make a lot of stuff that I would not normally want or be able to do. Um, Before I got my first printer, I knew at least 2 or 3 years before that I wanted to buy a 3D printer, specifically so I could prototype products. So this has been essentially on the back burner until it became affordable for actually a couple years now. So if you 3D printing is really good for stuff like that. So if you know you want to do prototyping or you want to create your own games or something similar to that, if you like doing your own 3D models, um, it actually does make a lot of sense. The type of 3D printer, though, will depend a lot on what you're doing. So in most cases, I want to do fast prototyping, so finishing is not always a necessity. So FDM printing makes more sense. And I will actually switch out my fine nozzle to a really super thick nozzle, depending on what I'm doing. So when I was, actually a great example is I took an existing tape dispenser design that I found online. Yeah, I could actually make a lot of cosplay stuff actually. I won't lie, I really want to make a set of armor right now. But I am busy doing my Kickstarter, so I do really want to be successful in that, so I'm putting a lot of effort and time into that. But using a 0.8 nozzle to do fast prototyping is really good. If you know that you're finishing something too, you can actually get your prints done a lot faster with the really thick nozzles. So for my tape dispenser, I got the basic design off somebody else's design. The problem I had with it is it didn't have sink holes for screws or bolts, which I wanted, so I can actually secure it to my table, my work table. And the design was not rugged enough, and it didn't accept my rolls of tape. So in this case, I essentially made it thicker. I modified some of the measurements to it. I actually, for the most part, I redesigned most of it. But I used essentially the initial base as a template. I still had to remodel everything. I simplified a couple things as well, because I found certain things that I didn't actually need. The only thing I left intact really was the center portion, but I had to reprint all the inside parts and outside. But stuff like that. So getting a tape dispenser like that for my specific use, because this is a very specific design, probably would have run me about $50 to $100, but it probably would have been made out of steel, and that price is also without shipping. And yeah, I really want to make body armor with this. So I have two main types of filaments. The filament I'm using right now is a rigid filament, but I have TPU, which is a flexible filament, which is perfect for body armor or any cosplay stuff, depending on what you're doing. In most cases, what I do is I make a base and then I make a mold for it after I finished it. And the only reason why I do that is if I have to make multiple portions, then I can actually just make them fairly easily at a fairly high speed. So yeah, you can make a lot of cool stuff. You can make both functional things and more artisanal pieces as well. And I do use it for both. Most of it though, I've been using it for prototyping. So yeah, it's taken a while to learn the nuances. And I've been experimenting for about a year and a half on 20-sided dice because they're like literally one of the hardest things you can try to design. Like designing is easy, but trying to design the molds for it, get everything to work properly, understanding what your casting limitations are, those are very technical things, and there's a lot of trial and error. But it's worth it because now the other stuff that I'm making is actually way easier. So I've made most of the mistakes that do exist. Actually, Tekikun, I apologize if I missaid your username. Could you let me know if you're actually able to hear my audio? I know that there's a bit of a delay, but if you could let me know if you're actually able to hear it. In the meantime, I'm actually going to respond to your text because I'm not sure if you're hearing it. Okay, awesome. I won't bother typing it. Sweet, thanks. For a lot of my stuff, I was looking into comparing resin printing with FDM printing. So for the most part, resin printing until just recently hasn't been really an option. Because of the resins are generally a lot more toxic. They're not using resins that can be used indoors easily unless you have a very well ventilated area. But the resolution is amazing. Uh, so maybe one day I'll be able to actually get one of those machines because that would have actually been my preferred machine. But they are very messy to clean up. They require a very specific workflow as well. So the workflow is different than regular FDM printing. But the resolution is there. In most cases, you can actually get away with not actually finishing or sanding your pieces, but the health risk is just not worth it for me because, like I said, I can't ventilate my area very well at all. My apartment does not allow for that currently. And I don't have a good sense of smell, so I would not know if something was poisoning me, which is unfortunate. Yeah, actually, 3D printing is actually really on its way. There's a couple of new technologies that have actually just come out recently. Um, One is, I don't know how old this one is. It has existed, I think, for the past year at least. Is essentially it's a giant needle that goes into a vat of gel, and it just squirts out the. I don't know what type of chemical it is. Um, and essentially immediately solidifies. The cool thing about that is I believe that the gel is fully recyclable, so don't quote me on that. But you can actually just pull it out and clean it off, and I don't think the gel is actually toxic, which is nice. Now, the only thing I think is an issue still is that because it's a giant needle, essentially, the issues you may run into is flex in the needle, so accuracy may be an issue. There is another form of resin printing which I just heard about recently, though, where they actually bombard the resin in multiple angles simultaneously. So rather than having to wait a couple of hours, you actually have a fully, essentially rendered piece in, I think, a couple of minutes. They're still working on technology for that. It's still fairly new. But we're probably going to be seeing resin printing like that probably in the next 1 or 2 years, I guess. It would depend on what hurdles they discover. I think repeatability is probably going to be the most difficult portion, because I think the way it's working is it's the cross section of, I don't know if it's lasers or it's being projected. I think it's a projection based technology, but trying to figure it so that it's repeatable every time is going to be the hard part. So it is coming, it's just going to take a while, a couple more years, which is not bad. Considering how long it took for just 3D printing in general to become mainly adopted, we are seeing it innovate very quickly. And a lot of that has to do with most of the patents expiring. What a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of this technology has existed for a while, but it was patented for obvious reasons. It's great technology. But the innovation that we're seeing at such a rapid rate is because those patents are starting to expire. So this print is approximately 70% done. So it's actually starting to finish up the top layers. You can actually see the details on the tips right now. So this final print will actually have little indents and grooves similar to the original reference that was actually given to me in this case. And I will show you a little close-up of it. Actually, I'll show it to you now because I know that the printing head will actually cover it up, so you won't be able to see it. But this was the previous print, this guy here. So it actually turned out pretty darn good. Yeah, if I really wanted to make it look a little nicer, I'd probably sand it a little bit, but honestly, you really don't need it all that much. If I'd use a different filament, there's some of them that you can actually use a chemical process to smooth it. Something like that would have actually probably been perfect in this case, just to smooth out the filament lines a little bit, because it would just need a very small amount of that just to finish it off. Yeah, actually, PLA actually picks up, because I'm using PLA because it's the least toxic. It's actually biodegradable. Yeah, this stuff actually spray paints really easily. To give you guys an idea, this is a prototype that I did for somebody else. So this is their character. Now, because it was a prototype, I wasn't too worried about the painting. This was actually dyed, the resin that it was cast in, and this was actually pre-finished as well. This was actually on my old machine too. So I suspect that if I were to actually reprint this, this would be actually a lot nicer. This one is a prototype because it wasn't the full resolution that it needed to be. So I'll see. This is a big statue though, so I'll try to get maybe just the head in. There you go. You can barely see it. So that's the head. It's a pretty big statue. So this was done on my old 3D printer before it decided to stop working permanently. And that was essentially the best detail I could get before I moved on to A, better filament, and B, just a better printer in general. But yeah, the original 3D print for that accepted spray paint very easily. It's still recommended that you use a primer of some sort, so just keep that in mind. There's actually a lot of people who are playing D&D will actually spray paint with primer first and then paint it. So it's still recommended that you do spray paint it, but it's a lot easier. Just to give you guys an idea of like how useful 3D printing can be, the spool of filament that I have, you can actually 3D print the spool holder for it. And I actually did that originally when I first got this machine. A lot of the mods that I had were actually all 3D printed with just regular PLA. And they actually made the use of this machine a lot easier because of how they were working. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I guess the nozzle isn't too much in the way. But yeah, so this is essentially, you see it? There we go. That's essentially the piece right there. Is this guy. So it turned out pretty darn good. How it looks to begin with. So this is the cleaned up version. This is actually right off the print. So these little areas here actually pop right off, and when you pop those off, it gives you that nice little finished edge on the tip there. So that's the nice thing about this. So now I have 2 flowery coins as test pieces. Now, when I printed this, it was like this. However, if you're printing really tiny and you're worried about resolution, I have found that tilting it just slightly like this, but at 30 degrees roughly, or 45, can give you really nice results. And I'll show you. I should have my seals that I made. I have the cast ones. Okay, so these are really, really tiny. Okay, So these are cast in resin, once again. But this is actually the resolution that you can get if you orient correctly. So this is, like I said, cast in resin. I made the mold from it, but I actually printed it originally and then made a silicone-based mold for this. And something very similar to this will actually probably be used for my Kickstarter if I reach certain goals. Now I did 2 of these. This has my symbol on it. So this one, that's my Yarkspiri Fantasy Art logo. However, this logo is Graham Spalding's logo. I may still have the link in the description as well for that. So I did his pieces because we are collaborating on a piece. And depending on how that goes, essentially I'll be making a limited edition set of these. And then after, I have to actually destroy the mold and give him all the files as well, because I don't own the rights to his logo. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Do you guys have any, please let me know if you guys have any more questions while I'm still streaming, because otherwise I'm probably going to get back to work. I still have a lot of work to do on my Kickstarter. And just so you guys know, I will be posting a link and posting a video on my YouTube channel the moment my Kickstarter is active. So keep an eye out for that. There's already a teaser video out, so if you're curious about it, it is already on my channel. You can definitely check that out. Yeah, I'm also happy I've made made progress. It's like I said, it took about 1.5 years, so I know a lot more than I did 1.5 years ago, though. I can tell you that much. All right. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you guys soon. So thank you and take care.